I've been doing a survey of the Hebrew Bible, looking at each book grammatically. And what I'm doing now is the book of Nahum. And so we pick up the book of Nahum by looking first of all at the title. The book gets its name from its author, Nahum, meaning compassionate. The Septuagint has Nahum, and the Vulgate Nahum or Nahum. He was from El-Kosh in 1-1, a city unknown but located possibly or probably in Judah. As to the author, the book is a complete unit and should be regarded in its totality, I believe, as the work of Nahum. The critic rejects this and endeavors to show that 1-2 and 2-3 are the remains of an acrostic song, which was not composed until after the exile and prefixed to the already existing portion of the book. This view, however, is purely subjective and without objective evidence, in my understanding. It is best then, I believe, to understand as that written by the prophet Nahum himself, who prefixed chapter 1-2 to 2-3 to his message in order to give the magnificent power and glory of God before announcing the specific means whereby God would demonstrate that glory and power. As to the date, since the conquest of Thebes is regarded as past in 3-8, and serve the city of Nineveh, and since the city of Nineveh is yet to be destroyed, the ministry of Nahum must fall somewhere. It is believed between 663 and 612 BC. In terms of its historical background, previously the city of Nineveh had repented at the preaching of Jonah. We see this in 760 BC. Following this, however, she became more and more wicked and violent, engaging in many Assyrian atrocities. In 722 BC, Assyria then took the northern kingdom into captivity and transplanted foreign people into Samaria. Some years later, in 701 BC, Sennacherib tried to capture Jerusalem, but was miraculously defeated by the Lord. In 663 BC, Thebes, a powerful city in Egypt, fell, and Judah was again under real threat. In that same year, Ashurbanipal, a great Assyrian leader, died, and weaker kings followed him. Egypt revolted in 629 BC, and finally in 612 BC. Nineveh fell then, as Babylon, Media, and Scythia allied together against her to destroy Nineveh. It was during this period of years of greatest strength and gradual decline that Nahum carried out his ministry. Penned after the fall of Thebes in 663 BC, and sometime before 612 BC, the prophecy was certainly then well received by the southern kingdom, who was being menaced at that time by this great power. When one views the prophecy in light of the powerful city of Nineveh, The miraculous element cannot be overlooked. The city at the time seems to be impregnable, yet God, as we saw with Edom in the book of Obadiah, humbled it. Hannah briefly summarizes the city. The city of Nineveh was the Assyrian stronghold and had an ancient history. For all intents and purposes, it was impregnable, with 100-foot wall and 60 miles wide in circumference. 3 chariots could drive abreast on top of the wall, and within was enough space for the growing of crops to withstand a siege. In addition, the Tigris River flowed through the city to supply it with water. Such a fortified city was likewise held by a warlike people. The Assyrians were militarists, but they ultimately fell to the inexperienced Babylonians. As to purpose of the book, the purpose of the prophecy is to prophesy the downfall and destruction of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. The prophet first of all describes the terrible sins of Nineveh and then details its overthrow and destruction in very vivid yet accurate language. By the way, Nahum is written in very vivid and accurate Hebrew, and the language is very, very, can I say, vivid in the way that the Hebrew reads. As to the overview and argument of the book, the theme of the book of Nahum is the doom of Nineveh. In the book, the prophet sets forth the judgment to come on Nineveh, Assyria's capital city. The book might be then outlined as follows. There is the declaration, first of all, of Nineveh's judgment in chapter 1. This is then followed by the description of that judgment in chapter 2, and then the cause for the judgment in chapter 3. The prophet, first of all, introduces the book by acknowledging his burden concerning Nineveh. He then describes the nature of God who is going to judge Nineveh. As he describes the Lord, he is described as a jealous God who will take vengeance on his adversaries in 1:2. While he is patient, he will not at all acquit the wicked, Nahum says in 1:3. The sovereignty of the Lord is illustrated in his control, first of all, over nature. Nahum declares, he rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up the rivers. Bashan languishes, and Carmel. And the flower of Lebanon also languishes. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence. Yes, the world and all that dwell in it. In verses 4-6 of chapter 1. Along with his sovereignty comes then his anger against his enemies who do evil. The prophet says his fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. In the middle of this declaration of God's wrath comes a different picture of the Lord for those who trust in him. He is described as faithful and obedient, and he is a refuge in the day of trouble. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the time of trouble, and he knows those who trust him, Nahum says in verse 7. For his enemies, however, he is to be feared. Instead of providing protection for them, he will make a full end of them, Nahum is saying, and those who do very evil and violent things. The prophet proceeds now, after describing the nature of the judge, to describe the nature of the judgment in chapter 1, 9 to 15. No one is to imagine that the Lord will not punish his enemies, for he will make an utter end of them, Nahum says, and they will never afflict his people again. In 1:9, they shall be devoured like stubble, Amos writes, before that is fully dry. Now, as we look at the wicked, then, pronouncements, for example, of Rabshakeh against the Lord, this is recalled in 1:11. He had mocked the Lord. And the Lord promises Nineveh's downfall, even though the whole nation should resist him, in 1:12. Never again will Israel be afflicted by them, Nahum says, for the Lord shall break the Assyrian yoke off his people. Nineveh shall be judged and destroyed, Nahum writes. The prophet declares this in verse 14. And the Lord has given a commandment concerning you, that no more in your name will be sown, that no more of your name will be sown. Out of the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the molten image, and I will make your grave, for you are vile. This is Amos writing about Assyria in verse 14 of 1. Because of this unbroken yoke in Assyria, the children of Israel, then Amos says, can rejoice. Joyful news of peace is now come to Israel. Nahum challenges her, O Judah, keep your sovereign or your solemn feasts, perform your vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through you, for he is utterly cut off. In verse 15, Amos writes. In chapter 2, the description of Nineveh's judgment is then clearly set down in verses 2, 1 to 13. First of all, in superb poetry, and this is very beautiful poetry in Hebrew, the prophet depicts the siege of the city in chapter 2, 1 to 5. 1, to dash them in pieces, Medo-Babylonian forces has come up against the city in 2, 1 and 2. Enemy soldiers, Nahum writes, will attack the city. Chariots will rage in the streets and shall jostle against one another. And the nobles of the city shall stumble as they run to defend the city walls. The actual means whereby the city would be conquered is then given, and the river through the city would overflow and wash away part of the city walls. And according to historical records, that is exactly what happened. Nineveh is pictured as then defeated and her spoil being taken by the enemy in 2, 7 to 10. The prophet lucidly describes her complete devastation. And Nineveh is of old like a pool of water. Yet they shall flee away. Stand, stand, shall they cry, but none shall look back. Take the spoil of silver, take the spoil of gold, for there is no end of the store and glory out of all the pleasant furniture. She is empty, void, and waste, and the heart melts. and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all her loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness. Amos writes this in 2:8 to 11 or to 10. Desolation and ruin fills the city. Where is the mighty Nineveh that has devoured so many of her enemies? Amos writes in 2:11 to 12. The city, who had filled itself with plunder of other cities, now lies plundered herself in 2:13. In chapter 3, then, the cause of this destruction of Nineveh is then outlined. Her sins are first of all announced in 3:1 to 7. Violence, brutality, and false dealings with other nations have possessed Assyria. She is described as the bloody city, full of lies and robbery in 3:1. Multitudes have been slain by her. Nahum writes, the horseman sits up, both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there is a multitude of slain and a great number of carcasses, and there is no end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses. Amos is writing here about the violence of the Assyrian Empire and what was going on at this time. Her false dealings with other nations is then described as she has sold nations through her harlotries and families through her witchcrafts, Nahum said. Because of this, the Lord will show the nations her nakedness and the kingdoms her shame. She shall become a gazing stock, and no mourners will mourn for her. Again, describing Nineveh's demise and judgment. Like the destruction of another city, Thebes, which set by the Nile, Amos refers to that. Nineveh will be sacked and destroyed in chapter 3:8 to 11. Although Thebes was fortified by rivers and by an alliance with Ethiopia at the time in Egypt, she will be defeated. Nahum writes, Nineveh also, regardless of her security, will be thrown down. He warns in this way, all your strongholds shall be like fig trees, and your first ripe figs. If they are shaken, they shall even fall to the mouths of the eater. Behold, your people in your midst of you are women. The gates of your land shall be set wide open into your enemies. The fire shall devour your bars. In 3:12 to 13. Though the city prepares for the siege, Nahum writes, destruction will come in verses 14 to 17. In the concluding verses, in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 3, the prophet prophetically addresses the king of Assyria, describing his inevitable and permanent defeat. Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Your nobles shall dwell in the dust. Your people are scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathers them. When such destruction does come, all who hear will rejoice because of it, he says in verse 19 of chapter 3. So the book of Nahum is a book about the judgment of Nineveh and hence the judgment of Assyria because of her horrible violence upon everyone that she had attacked and destroyed. So just a summary of the book, we have the declaration of Nineveh's judgment again in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we have the description of Nineveh's judgment. And finally, in chapter 3, we have the cause of Nineveh's judgment.